Good evening. You can turn to Matthew 5 if you'd like. We'll read there together. Matthew 5. One thing that has happened in my life that I did not expect to happen is exemplified by this building right here. So this weekend, Curry and I made a quick trip to Dallas for a funeral. And while we were down there, we wanted to see, neither of us had ever been, she had never been to Texas before, actually, so she had lived a good life. No, I'm just kidding, up to this point. But I've been to Texas, but I've never been outside of the airport in Dallas, so I'd never actually seen Dallas. So we wanted to experience it a little bit. And we checked out this Museum of Art. So this is what has happened to me that I never would have expected. I like art museums, which is very strange. If I had told myself that a few years ago, I probably would have made fun of myself. But they're actually really cool and preserve a lot of really neat history that's fun to see. Like this thing. Whatever this guy is, he was really big. And you walk in and he's like way up there to the left. And he's made of styrofoam and paint, which is pretty cool. He's looking down at Curry. Or this guy, who I personally enjoyed. He was also in the Dallas Art Museum, just sitting there like this. I don't know what he's doing that for, but he was just hanging out. And one of the cool things about art is that there's a message to art, right? It has a meaning, some kind of meaning. A lot of the times when we see it, we might be confused by it, but it has some kind of meaning. And oftentimes it subverts our expectations. Like this guy on the left here. He is actually, I stared at him for a while. I don't know why. He was just, he's more interesting than some of the other stuff. So I was staring at him for a long time before I realized he has a little human down here as well. So he subverted my expectations. I thought the whole point was how big he was. And actually, the whole point was how small the little guy is. That's just one example of how art likes to do this. But for another example that has some relevance to our lesson tonight, this is from a piece of art that I have never seen, but it was done by two people named Tim Noble and Sue Webster. So let's imagine that by the way, Sue is a great last name, but let's imagine that you go to an art gallery showing, right? A gallery show. And you walk into a room and you see this. For a lot of us, our thought probably is something like, oh, okay, so it's one of these kinds of art shows. No idea what this means, but it's probably weird and offensive, and nobody's going to explain it. It's just going to be there, right? That's probably what a lot of us would think if we walked in on this at an art gallery. But the whole point of this is that after you've been in there for a moment, someone hits the lights, and you can see that these random configurations of wood actually end up being kind of a really cool piece of art. They show that the illumination shows people on the wall. Now, another example from this same gallery is this. It's an old table, and on top of it are a bunch of cans, beer cans and Coke cans. And if you look at it pretty closely, you'll see that all of these cans have been shot through with BBs. So someone just absolutely went off on these cans with a BB gun, and the entire setting is torn up by BB shots. But when you hit the lights, you'll see that there's something else going on with this piece of art. All of these pieces of trash, this table, these cans full of holes, actually were there for a purpose. They're there to create the New York City skyline on the wall. This beer can is the Empire State Building, and the BB shots are the windows in the buildings. One more example. This is the finished product when the lights are on. You can see that this pile of trash. Lots of McDonald's in there, which I can't stand McDonald's. I don't know the last time I had McDonald's. So definitely trash piled up on this floor. And when the lights are hit, you can see that, hopefully you can tell, that there are two people on the wall illuminated by this light created out of trash. And the whole point of these exhibits is to subvert our expectations. Because when we walk into a room and we see a pile of trash, we see a pile of trash. But the point is that when we hit the light, that pile of trash can become a really cool piece of art. And in fact, this piece of art is entitled Wasted Youth. And I think it's something that all of us, to one extent or another, at least people who are above maybe 12, can relate to. Wasted youth, wishing that we had done something different in our past, wishing that something about our lives would be just a little bit different, that the trash that we have encountered would be illuminated by light and would change. So I think this is one of the things that interests me about art, but also about Jesus. Because in a manner of speaking, Jesus is an artist. This is why he speaks in parables a lot. Parables are an art form. And the whole point of art is that it imitates life, right? And life, also vice versa, imitates art. And that's what parables do. Parables imitate life, and life imitates the parables. Over and over again, what Jesus does, not just in his parables, but throughout his entire existence, what he does is subvert our expectations. And what we read about in Matthew chapter 5 is no exception to that rule. If you will, let's read verse 1 together. It says, "Seeing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him." Now, if you remember, in the Old Testament, the story of God's people, this is their story, at least a part of it. So first, they are slaves in Egypt, right? So they're in Egypt, and they come out of Egypt through the water. They have the crossing of the Red Sea. Then they're in the wilderness for 40 years, wandering, being tested. And then they arrive at the Promised Land, and at the border of the Promised Land, they enter into a deep, solemn covenant with God, right? So those are kind of the 5 steps of this part of Israel's story. From Egypt, through the water and wilderness, into the Promised Land, or at least to the border of it, and they receive a covenant from God. Now, those are the 5 steps. But notice that to this point in Matthew, if you're familiar with the book of Matthew, you might remember that Matthew has shown Jesus to us. And he's shown him coming out of Egypt, going through the waters of baptism and the wilderness. Instead of 40 years for Israel, it's 40 days for Jesus in the wilderness. And he's gone into the land of promise in Matthew chapter 4. And here in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 is his new covenant. So you can see the parallels that are happening here, where there's a new law that's taking place in what we call the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. To unpack this a little bit more, and not only how there's a new law, but also how Jesus is a new Moses. Y'all are just going to have to let me nerd out for a minute here. But there's a new law and a new Moses, right? So in Matthew 11, verses 13 and 14, it tells us that John the Baptist was the last Old Testament prophet. It says that all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. So John is the last Old Testament prophet. And his ministry ends, and someone greater than him comes onto the scene. There's a new era. Old Testament prophets are out. A new era is in. And here in Matthew chapter 5, we find out what that new era is. Because there are several hints in the very beginning of this text that tell us that something new is happening. A new covenant, a new law, a new Moses is coming onto the scene. First of all, this phrase that he went up onto the mountain from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 1 is verbatim a quote from the Greek Old Testament. And it occurs 3 times in the Greek Old Testament, and every time it's talking about Moses going up onto the mountain to receive the law from God. So Jesus goes up on the mountain, just like Moses did. But also, Matthew here describes the mountain, and so the word "the" is really weird in Greek. Sometimes it's there when you think it should be. Most of the time it's not there when you think it should be. It's really confusing. But long story short, Matthew uses the word "the" here in a way that he normally doesn't to refer to a mountain. So he seems to be recalling the mountain of the Old Testament, that this is the mountain that Moses went up on to receive the law. The last little hint that we'll talk about is that Matthew describes Jesus. What does he say in verse 1? He sits down to teach, right? And if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 9, that's the same stance that Moses was in when he receives the law. So, long nerd story short, there's a new law happening here. There's a new covenant. There's a new Moses who's come onto the scene. There's something different in this person, Jesus. He's taking the story of Israel and renewing it in himself with a lot of really cool twists and turns. And that brings us to our title for tonight, which is Blessed Are the Beaten. This comes from verses 3 through 12 of Matthew 5, which is what we oftentimes call the Beatitudes. And I want us to read them together as we begin tonight. But I want us to try something a little bit different. In the text, it says that Jesus sat and taught, and the crowd was standing. So, you know what we're going to do? Because I have a history of getting us to sit and stand at weird and not normal times, right? Most of the time it's when I'm leading singing, but tonight it's going to be during the sermon. So if you will, everybody stand together. And I'm going to sit, not because I'm Jesus, but because I'm reading his words. And I guess I'll be away from the mic, but hopefully you can still hear me. Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 12. And feel free to read this along with me if you'd like. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Y'all can sit down. The Beatitudes. They don't seem all that complicated. When you read through them, it seems like Jesus wants us to be these things, and so he attaches blessings to them. It's pretty simple. And it is. But it's simple in the way that a swimming pool is simple. Because if you get into a swimming pool, let's say you take a step in, and yep, it's a swimming pool, right? Your feet are wet. It's exactly what you expected to happen. But then let's say that you take a few steps. And what on earth does it mean to be poor in spirit? And who in the world has used the word meek in any conversation outside of this building in the last year, right? Now let's say you take a few more steps and the pool is now up to my waist. And why does Jesus pronounce a blessing on people who cry a lot? Isn't that something I generally don't want to do? And why are people who get beat up blessed, right? That's where he ends. And that's definitely something I don't want to happen very often at all, if ever. I'd rather not be persecuted, right? I don't want to experience that. So if we keep going into the pool, and now we're up to our necks, and we're like, what does it even mean to be blessed in the first place? Blessed how? Blessed by whom? Blessed to what end? And who is he even saying these things to in the first place? And of all the things you could use to open up the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the most famous teachings ever of all time, why is this how we open it? So it's simple in the way that a swimming pool is simple, where you can read it and get the gist of what he's getting at. But you can also go deeper and see, wow, there's more here than what meets the eye. This swimming pool is actually a lot deeper than I thought it was at first. So in my mind, there's these cute little sayings might seem harmless, right? Because what's dangerous about 9 blessings pronounced on people? But I'm convinced that they're deeply challenging for us. And that if we learn what they're really about, if we hear them rightly, they have the potential to transform how we view ourselves and how we view other people and how we view God. I think there's a lot going on with these 9 blessings. And the question for me that helps to unlock the deep end of the pool and maybe even starts to help us stay afloat is the question, to whom is Jesus even saying this stuff? Who is he talking to in Matthew chapter 5? Because it's tempting to take this section out of its context and kind of view it as a little pamphlet of Jesus ethics, right? To say what we read in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, and especially for tonight, verses 3 through 12, that's just kind of how Jesus wants us to live. It's a moral lesson that we're supposed to take. It's a do and don't do. It's a good and bad. It's a checklist that we should take from Jesus and live out. But if we do that, I'm convinced that we'll really misunderstand what Jesus is up to here. And I think it'll help us to walk through maybe a different perspective on this text, because chapter 5 comes after chapter 4, right? Groundbreaking insight there. Chapter 5 comes right after chapter 4. And in chapter 4, Matthew has done this incredibly helpful thing where he sums up the entire message of Jesus into one phrase. This is in verse 17 of chapter 4, where he says, "From that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" So, the kingdom is at hand. The kingdom is here. Now, if someone walked into this room right now and stood right here in the middle of the aisle and just called out, "The nation has arrived," what? We would all be very confused, and probably I'd be pretty scared because I'm probably the easiest target up here, right? So we probably would be kind of off-put if someone just comes in and says, "The nation has arrived." But that's pretty much what Jesus is doing here. The kingdom is here. The nation has arrived. But these people don't seem confused. They don't seem off-put. Instead, they seem excited. Because we're going to read the rest of the chapter where tons of people are flocking to Jesus and following him. But they're excited, and it's because they've been waiting for this kingdom for a really long time now. Because for centuries, Israel, God's people of the Old Testament, have been oppressed by various nations. They've just lived a really tough life. But throughout that whole dark existence, they've been holding on to this promise that God isn't done with them yet. They've been holding on to the promises from the Old Testament about the kingdom that's coming, about this king who's bringing a kingdom that's going to make everything right, that will restore the glory days of Israel. And one example of this is in Daniel chapter 2. I want us to read it together. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. Ken, I think the clicker gave out, so you might have to click for me. Daniel 2, verse 44. "And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever." So, here's one of many promises about this kingdom that's coming one day, and it's going to stand forever. It's going to break into pieces all of these kingdoms who've been oppressing Israel for so long, and it's going to stand. That's Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And here comes this guy, Jesus, with this announcement. Hear ye, right? The kingdom is here. What you've been waiting on is finally here. And look in Matthew chapter 4, starting in verse 23. Notice what he's doing with this. Matthew 4:23. "And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan." So, there's this big movement that's kickstarting here, right? Jesus is going around to all these different villages, and he's spreading the good news that the kingdom is here. So for his sermon, the short version is, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." But then Matthew gives us the longer version, and that's what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It seems like the Sermon on the Mount was probably a typical Jesus teaching session. We have a similar sermon in Luke chapter 6. We call it the Sermon on the Plain. But it seems like Jesus would go to different places, and this was his core message, at least at this point in his ministry. He would say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and so on. So Matthew is giving us a glimpse here of what it would have been like to stand at the feet of Jesus and to hear him teach. So, what we're reading here in Matthew 5, 3 through 12, they're not just abstract moral ideals from Jesus. They're part of a bigger announcement, and that is the kingdom is here. God's reign is arriving here on earth in a way that we've been waiting on it for so long. And when we think of a kingdom, like Daniel says in Daniel 2, a kingdom that's breaking in pieces, all of these other kingdoms, we know what that looks like, right? We see it right now in our world. It looks like bitterness and bombs and bloodbaths. That's what it looks like. When kingdoms break in pieces other kingdoms. That's what we're expecting. But this kingdom is different. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, it says that he shall judge. This is talking about the king who's coming with this kingdom. He shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. He's a peacemaker. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. In other words, their weapons are turned into farming instruments. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So this kingdom that's coming and breaking into pieces all of these other kingdoms, it's not doing it through weaponry. It's doing it through some other means, because this kingdom is different. It subverts our expectations. It comes in a way that we don't expect kingdoms this great to come into the world. So we might say that this king and his kingdom are works of art. And Jesus is claiming that this kingdom vision is happening in him, that he is the king that they've been waiting on. And he's come in the Sermon on the Mount to give his law. So all of these people are flocking to Jesus. And notice what kinds of people they are at the end of Matthew chapter 4. They're sick people. They're people in pain. They're people who are oppressed by demons, the people who everyone calls crazy. They're people having seizures, probably while he's teaching. Maybe someone is having a seizure in the crowd. They're paralyzed people that are coming to Jesus. And Roman society was so good for the world in a lot of ways. There were more people with clean drinking water at this point because of their aqueducts than in the history of humanity. And the roads did so many great things, and they're the seabed of democracy. There are a lot of good things about the Roman culture. But at the same time, it was the most cutthroat culture you could ever even imagine. No, there was no health care, there was no welfare, no food stamps. I mean, if you are one of these people who is coming to Jesus, you live in the slums. You are pushed to the absolute margins of society. You are working today for money to make it through today. And you're going to do the same thing tomorrow and the next day. That's just how life was. There was no helping out the people who were on the margins of society. And Matthew makes it a point to tell us that these people are the people who are coming to Jesus. These people. The broken people, the beaten people. Now, our question to ask of these 9 blessings that unlocks the deep end is, who is Jesus talking to anyway? And that is the answer. In verse 1 of Matthew 5, you'll notice that it says that the disciples came to him and he taught them. And when we read the word disciples, if you've spent much time in the New Testament, and most people in this room have, then you probably think of the 12 apostles, right? Those are kind of used synonymously sometimes, disciples and apostles. But if you remember where we're at in the story, the apostles, the 12 apostles at least, are not a thing yet. They won't happen for a few more chapters. Matthew chapter 4, some of the first people that we come to know as apostles have been called to follow Jesus. But a disciple is just someone who's following Jesus, right? So who is following Jesus at this point? Well, lots of people, and primarily it seems to be some fishermen that would become apostles, but sick and poor and hurting people are following Jesus at this point. And what does he say to this crowd of disciples who are unimportant and insignificant and sick and just scraping by? He says, blessed are the beaten. That's his message. Blessed are the beaten. Now, in that setting, words like these are electric. I think that's the best word to describe them. They meet people in a place where they need them. And this, going back to this work of art, this art is about perception, right? Because what we perceive as trash and as really worthless has the potential to have real beauty and significance and meaning the moment that the light hits it. It transforms our perception of it. And that gives us an inkling, I think, of what Jesus is accomplishing with these words. Because the people he's talking to are not important. Of course they're important to Jesus. Of course they're important to God. But from the perspective of the world, of people of their day, these people don't matter. But Jesus is coming to them, and he's promising them the blessings of the kingdom of God. And he's saying, you're going to inherit the entire earth. And he's saying that you're going to meet God and even be adopted by him. You people who've been beaten by the world, that's you. That's your lot in life, your blessing. So this work of art is taking pre-existing materials and rearranging them in ways that are unique. And once a surprise hits, we're like, oh, wow, I never saw that coming, right? And that's exactly what Jesus is doing. Because if there's anywhere where the maxim that art imitates life and vice versa shouldn't make sense, it's here. It doesn't make sense that the beaten of our world are blessed. That's not how our world works, right? So it shouldn't work like that. But Jesus is thoroughly convinced that in his kingdom, in his law, that is how this works. But here's the question. And this is the question that we'll finish out tonight with. And then next time I preach, I plan on actually going through the Beatitudes one by one and talking about them. But this question will cover the rest of our time. And that is, what does it mean for Jesus, for a Jewish rabbi, a teacher, to tell these people at this place and in this time that they are blessed? Because the word blessing has a lot of different connotations in our world. And I think it's good to step back and to talk even for a moment about maybe the historical background of this saying. Because Jesus is not the first person to talk like this. This idea of a Jewish rabbi pronouncing blessings on people has a very long history in Jewish communities. And it actually has its root in the Bible itself, the Old Testament. If you remember how the book of Psalms starts, Psalm 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Blessed is the man," there's a beatitude, right? "Blessed is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord." So to say that someone is blessed is to hold up this example, to say we should be like this guy, because this guy has relational clarity between himself and his Creator. He has a good relationship with God. And he's experiencing the good fruit of that good relationship. And that's verse 3. This guy's blessed. Therefore, he is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and all that he does, he prospers. So this is what it means to be blessed by God. It means you have a good relationship with God, and you're experiencing the fruit from that relationship. And so this way of talking about God and blessings from God continues in Judaism. And there's a very famous Jewish teacher from about 150 years before Jesus, who was also named Jesus. His name was Jesus ben Sira. He's a very famous teacher, and he comes onto the scene, and he writes this collection of teachings called The Wisdom of Ben Sira. And in those teachings, now, he has this particular block that is very famous, where he pronounces blessings on people. So get what's going on here. This is Jesus pronouncing blessings on people 150 years before Jesus pronounces blessings on people. So I think this is pretty interesting. And in the Wisdom of Ben Sira, he says this: "There are 9 whom I would call blessed. A 10th my tongue proclaims. Blessed is the man who can rejoice in his children. Blessed is the man who lives to see the downfall of his foes. Blessed is the man who lives with a sensible wife, and the one who does not plow with an ox and ass together. Blessed is the one who does not sin with his tongue, and the one who has not served an inferior. Blessed is the one who finds a friend, and the one who speaks to attentive listeners. How great is the one who finds wisdom, but none is superior to the one who fears the Lord." Now, as we read through that, to me, a lot of it sounds like the Bible, right? Like if someone stuck this in Proverbs, I probably would not question it. I don't know Proverbs well enough to call this out. So it sounds kind of like the Bible. But when you go back through it, you might notice some things that are a little bit off. I mean, think about this last blessing here, right? Because if we're holding up the ideal that these people are the people that God blesses, that God is with, that God is for, what about this blessing? That blessed is the one, essentially saying, blessed is the one who's so important, so that when they speak, people will listen to them, right? Blessed is the one who speaks to attentive listeners. Well, that's interesting, because he's saying that you know that you're blessed, that God is with you, that God is for you, if people think that you're important and want to listen to what you have to say. To me, that sounds questionable in light of the teachings of Jesus. But let's talk about another one. He says, blessed are you if you don't have to serve an inferior. Blessed are you, in other words, if you don't ever have to humble yourself and serve someone who is of a lower social rank than you are. That's how you know that God is with you. Well, that, to me, is, alarm bells are going off, because that sounds exactly like the kind of thinking that Jesus loved to expose, loved to say is exactly the opposite of how our God is. Just did that to keep you awake, right? Just had to slap the microphone. Let's do one more. And this is from the slide before. Man, I made it louder. I think I broke the mic. He says, blessed is the one who lives to see the downfall of his foes. So his success in business or whatever it is gets him to the point where no one can stand up against him and disagree with him. Everyone who comes up against him loses. So that's how you know that God is with you, because you win. Now, that's the idea of Ben Sira, who's a very famous teacher in Judaism. This is the world that Jesus lives in. This thinking of, especially of not serving an inferior, of seeing the downfall of your foes. I mean, this is Roman thinking to a T, right? This is the world of Jesus. And this is the world many of us experience as well. So if you're one of these hurting and oppressed and poor people that Jesus is talking to here, you hear Jesus start with blessed. And your thought is, okay, Jesus, you're a Jewish teacher. So you're about to talk to us about the healthy and the wealthy and the wise. And maybe you're going to help us to get to that point as well. Like maybe you're going to help us grow to get there. But that is exactly what Jesus does not do here. Knowing these people, knowing their flaws, knowing their brokenness, he actually affirms them exactly where they are. He says, there's some things about you that are pretty obvious to see, right? Like if you're missing a limb, if you can't see, if you can't hear, those things are pretty obvious pretty quickly when you're interacting with someone. And it's really easy to define other people by those qualities. We all do it. We all define each other by what we see from each other. Maybe some things are not quite as obvious as missing a limb, but we all define each other by the clothes that we wear. We all define each other by the way that we walk into a room. We all define each other by the jokes that we laugh at, the words that we say and don't say. We could go on and on. We all do this. We all judge each other based on these outward signs. So for them, as people are looking at them, at worst, they're thinking, well, you're lazy, you're entitled, you're lesser. Maybe at best, they're thinking you're unfortunate. But Jesus says, no, the kingdom is here, and it's coming to you first, not them. It's coming to you. You're the fortunate ones. Blessed are the beaten. And to the rest of the world, this crowd may have looked like those trash sculptures, right? Like garbage. But Jesus flips the light on, and he says, the kingdom of God is here, and it's here for you. It's bringing this whole reversal of how we view ourselves and our identity and our status and our value and our place in the family of God. To me, this is brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant from Jesus. And my question is, how can we not love this man? How can we not want to follow after this man? Because Jesus is not giving good guidance here. He's giving good news. That's the point. He's not saying, go and try to get yourself beat up. And if you do that, it's not going to hurt. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying cry a lot and someone will comfort you. He's not saying be meek and by tomorrow you'll own this plot of land. Because sometimes life kind of works out in some of those ways, but most of the time it doesn't. I'm pretty sure most of the times I've been crying in my life, someone is not there to comfort me, right? Maybe you've had the same experience. Anytime that I've been beat up in my life, usually it's my brother, and he's definitely not there to comfort me and make me feel better afterward, right? So that's not always how this world works. If Jesus is promising that that's what we're going to experience in this world, then he's off base, because that's not what most of our experience is. Because the world that Jesus seems to be talking about here, a world where the mourning people are comforted, a world where beat up people are happy, a world where meek people inherit the entire earth, that world is upside down. And we might say, really, that it's right side up. This isn't advice from Jesus. This is an announcement. This is saying that the world is different now. The kingdom is here, and that it changes everything. He's bringing these news of a kingdom where normal people, where below normal people really do reign, and where guns really are roses, and where the broken people of our world are actually the most whole. That's his kingdom. It's a kingdom that changes all of our perceptions about life, where trash really is treasure. He's letting us in on the biggest secret in human history. And it's a secret that's so hidden, we knew it all along. And that is, our world is upside down. But there's something better. There's something that we're being invited into, a way of viewing the world, a way of experiencing the world that says the beaten people, myself, whenever I'm beaten, other people that I see who are beaten in this world are really the most blessed ones, because they're the ones to whom the kingdom is coming. So to me, as we think through these words of Jesus, as he tells us, blessed are the beaten, to me it makes me think of the people who I know, the people who you know, who have been beaten down by life. I mean, I have faces that are in my mind right now of some of them are in this room, of people who, in one way or another, have lost the game of life. Maybe you are so successful on the outside. Maybe that's not where you've lost. But you've lost the thing that matters most to you, or relationships that matter so much to you. Whatever it is, maybe you, I know we all are. We've all been beaten by life in one way or another. And to me, as we sit at the feet of Jesus, or stand at the feet of Jesus, and we think through his upside down, right side up kingdom, he's inviting us into this reality where our world is not about winning. Our world is not about proving ourselves to everyone around us. Our world is not about beating everyone else, just beating everyone up the rat race of the corporate ladder and getting to the top before anyone else can. It's not a world where we're fighting for our grandkids' attention. For me, it's my niece. I have to fight for my niece's attention anytime I see her. It's not a world where we have to fight for validation from the people around us, from our parents, from our friends, from our elders, from our preachers, whatever it is. It's not a world where we have to fight. It's a world where we get to bless and be blessed. It's a world where we're invited to say that trash really is treasure and that everything is going to be all right in the end. To me, that's good news. The kingdom is good news. And if you haven't entered into the kingdom, I'm telling you, tonight is the time to do it. It's time to get started. It's time to view this world as a place where even the beaten are blessed. So if you need to make those first steps into following King Jesus tonight, won't you do it as we stand together and sing?
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's